Okay, so why are we only taking a peek into Celtic paganism today? Because there's a lot. It's a very broad term, and because of that, when one person refers to Celtic paganism, it can mean something vastly different from what another person refers to as Celtic paganism. So we'll choose a footpath. We'll draw back the greenery, and we'll take a peek. But don't worry, as time goes on, we will cover everything that we can possibly cover. I have an ever-growing list. If I don't touch on a topic today that you were hoping for, it's only because I couldn't fit it into this particular episode. Hey, I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey. What's the first thing you think of when you hear the words Celtic paganism? Is it the Druids? Is it the many gods and goddesses that make up each pantheon within such a broad topic? Does the Wheel of the Year come to mind? Maybe certain names like the Morrigan, Cernunnos, Brigg? First of all, what is paganism? Well, it really just depends on where in history you want to look. Historically, it was a term used by early Christians for pretty much any religion that was not Christianity, Judaism, or Samaritanism. It's used to negatively describe non-Abrahamic religious practitioners began in the 4th century, at least according to surviving sources. See, paganus, in Latin terms, is someone who lived in a rural district, rather than in a town. At first, it may have been innocent enough, using the Latin word pagani to simply describe the people of rural communities that maintained their local indigenous traditions and practices. Paganus may also have been used by Roman soldiers to describe the civilian people of the rural areas where the armies were stationed. The thought is that early Christians, who viewed themselves as soldiers of Christ, adopted the term to describe those who had not joined the religious movement. Through the Middle Ages and after, it came to be applied to any non-Christian religion as Christianity took over more and more of the landscape. It suggested, in a broad sense, the religions of peasants, because of the connotations that rural living invoked. Poor, dirty, uneducated, feral. You get the idea. It suggested a belief in false gods, as the Christians and other Abrahamic religions believed that they possessed theological truth because they have a one true God, and therefore everyone else was living in error because, well, demons. Alternative terms in Christian texts were Hellene, Gentile, and heathen, depending on which individual or groups of people were being spoken about. In our modern day, paganism applies to polytheistic religions as well as beliefs and practices centered around the worship and reverence of nature. It wasn't until the 20th century that people really began using it as a self-descriptor, as a way to reclaim the term and finally remove the derogatory implications. Now, the question is, what falls under the Celtic descriptor? Ireland, of course, Scotland, Isle of Man, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany in France. Of course, that was the Middle Ages and on. Before the Romans decided to expand their reach, Celtic tribes spanned much of Europe, extending as far east as Transylvania and as far south as northern Spain. There's even some evidence of Celtic peoples on the coast of the Black Sea and in what is now Turkey. So we can see why the term Celtic is much too broad of a term. It all depends on where on the historical timeline you're referring to, as well as where on the map. I have a strong interest in this topic, not just because there's something about it that calls to my soul, but also because a couple of years ago I managed to trace a line of my own ancestry that suggests Ireland was once where part of my family called home. My evidence was in the form of paperwork stating that my ancestor debarked from a ship here in America and that he was arriving from Ireland. I plan to see if I can find out more about that in the future. So we've basically covered who would have been practicing the Celtic pagan religions. In terms of ancient Celtic paganism, we don't have a whole lot of concrete first-hand records of beliefs and practices. Pretty much all of the evidence is gleaned from archaeology, literature from the early Christian period, and Greco-Roman accounts that, let's be honest here, probably aren't all that accurate. Celtic paganism is one belief system out of a larger group of polytheistic Indo-European religions, but it also encompasses a number of smaller groups. It's very complicated. There are over 400 deities in total that we know about within Celtic paganism alone, and many of them are viewed as threefold or triple deities. There were specific deities that were worshipped by locality, and as time marched on, the deities that were worshipped transformed, but always kept their broad similarities and deity framework. Like I said, it can get confusing because Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and Great Britain all had variations of these deities. As we start to talk about each deity, I'll more than likely be making references to other deities that you may already be familiar with. Part of that will have to do with the mythology, but the other part of it will have to do with the similarities between deities at each location. Like I said a few moments ago, we have very little truth to go on in terms of actual Celtic religious practices. The literary sources and accounts by Greco-Romans from that time period have a lot of bias because of their perceptions and overall political goals. Even now, as we uncover more and more archaeological evidence, it gets tinted by our mindset and perceptions as 21st century humans. Archaeologist Barry Cunliffe said it well. The sources for Celtic religion are fertile chaos, a term that was borrowed from Irish scholar Proncius McCanna. The problem is trying to organize all of the information in a systematic way, knowing that a lot of it was likely meant to further the political goals of the authors, while also getting the intricate interpretations correct and presenting them in a way that, 1, makes sense, and 2, doesn't detract from the micro details. Even the professionals say it's complicated. From what we do know of the ancient Celts, they seem to have been animists. They honored the forces of nature and lived in close connection to the earth and the elements. They believed that everything had a spirit, which would mean that there would be many local deities and spirits to be honored. Because of that, the overall list of deities, though quite long already, is probably fated to be eternally incomplete. The reason? Conquests, fear-mongering, brute force, torture, the power of greed, and the greediness of the ego. But also, it seems that the spiritual leaders of the ancient Celts may not have wanted their knowledge of their sacred beliefs to fall into the wrong hands, which may have been a wise move considering how far the reach of Rome became. The Romanization of Gaul due to Roman conquest began around 58 BCE, while Rome was still the Roman Republic. For southern Britain, it began around 43 CE. The conquests resulted in a fusion of religious practices over the course of centuries. Before that fusion, the Greco-Roman writers recorded that the Celts held ceremonies in sacred groves, stone circular structures, and some tribes built temples or ritual enclosures. When it came to the sacred groves, there were certain trees that were very sacred to the ancient Celtic people. Trees were often central to social and ceremonial meeting places. These places, in Gaulish, were called nemata, or singularly nematon. Oak trees were particularly sacred to the ancient Celts, especially the Druids, who were the esteemed religious leaders of the ancient Celtic world. The name Druid is thought to derive from the old Celtic root words deru, meaning oak tree, and wid, meaning to see or to know. Loosely translated, Druid means knower of the oak trees. Other sacred trees and bushes were hazel, holly, yew, ash, pine, and apple. Let me give you some examples. In the 1st century CE, Greek geographer and historian Strabo wrote that the Galatians, who were a Celtic people dwelling in Galatia, which was a region in what is now Turkey, would assemble a council of 300 men to pass judgment on murder cases. The assembly would take place in what Strabo called the Dry Nematum, or roughly translated, the Oak Sanctuary. Also, in the 1st century CE, Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder wrote of the Druids of Gaul. The Druids, for so their magicians are called, held nothing more sacred than the mistletoe and the tree that bears it, always supposing that tree to be the oak. But they chose groves of oak for the sake of the tree alone, and they never perform any of their rites except in the presence of a branch of it. The last example that I want to give you shows a bit of the efforts that the Romans put towards shining an unsavory light on the Celts. After all, they had to make sure that the Celts were seen as barbaric. The practices of the Celts were often referred to as savage rites, though there may be some grains of truth sprinkled into the following account. If you're easily creeped out because of an active imagination, I might suggest skipping ahead about 2 minutes. The following take on a sacred druid grove comes from the Roman poet Lucan, writing about a nematon that was said to have been destroyed by Julius Caesar in the 1st century BCE. He wrote, "There was a grove, untouched through long centuries, whose interlacing boughs enclosed cold and shadowy depths, the sunlight banished far above. It was sacred to no rural Pan, no sylvanous king of the wood, nor to the nymphs, but gods were worshipped there with savage rites, the altars piled high with foul offerings, and every tree drenched in human blood. On those boughs, if ancient tales respectful of deity may be believed, the birds feared to perch. In those coverts no wild beast would lie. On that grove no wind ever blew. No lightning bolt from the storm clouds fell, and the trees, spreading their leaves to an absent breeze, rustled of themselves. Water flowed there in copious dark streams, while the images of the gods, rough-hewn and grim, were merely crude blocks cut from felled trunks of trees. But their very age itself, and the ghastly color of their rotting timber, struck terror. Men feel less awe of deities in familiar forms. Their fear increases when the gods they dread appear as alien shapes. They also say the subterranean caves often shook and roared, that yew trees fell and then rose again, that flame glowed from trees free of fire, while serpents slithered and twined about their trunks. The people never gathered there to worship. They had abandoned the place to the gods, and when the sun was at the zenith, or night's blackness seized the sky, the priest himself dreaded those moments, afraid of surprising the Lord of the Wood." This account makes the sacred groves sound terrifying, no doubt, as it was designed to do. As stated before, it was in the Romans' best interest to make the Celts appear as uncivilized as possible, so they would have reason to conquer the land and Romanize it. The Gallic Wars, written by Julius Caesar, has some interesting viewpoints on the practices and ways of life of the Celts, if you're interested in checking that out. Now, there were also mentions of stone structures of a circular nature that were used by the Celts, megalithic monuments. An interesting thing about these structures is that many of them date back around the late Neolithic era through to the Bronze Age, which seems to predate the arrival of the Celts. We can only speculate what they had been used for before the Celts began using them, but we do have evidence that the Celts adopted these spots and used them for their own rituals and ceremonies. And some were even used as astronomical observatories, since a number of them align with certain celestial events, like Samhain and Beltane. Much of the sacred ritual spaces of the early Celts had natural features, like the groves. But as time went on, some timber structures were built with enclosures. They were often near one of the sacred natural spaces, as the Druids seem to have been central to carrying out much of the ceremonial practices that would generally involve the use of these sacred spaces. During the Iron Age, which was roughly 500 BCE to 40 CE, the Gaul, Belgica, and Britain tribes built square or circular temples out of timber, and the enclosures were generally rectangular. Once the Romans conquered the Celtic lands, those sacred sites were reused, and Roman temples took their place. That was only found to be the case in the northwestern Celtic regions of the Roman Empire, and these temples didn't look like the classical Roman temples that you'd see in Rome. These were, more than likely, influenced by the footprints of the older wooden Celtic temples. Though it seems that all of the natural bodies of water from springs to lakes were considered sacred, there were certain bodies of water and sources of water that were especially sacred. The springs at Sequana and Milennia, for example, both have evidence of a large array of votive offerings. In fact, archaeological evidence and some Greco-Roman accounts show that votive offerings were often deposited in bodies of water, wetlands, ritual shafts, and wells. Spirits or deities of water places were honored as givers of life and as links to the other world. Water, it seems, was one of the highly venerated elements. As such, offerings to gods, goddesses, and spirits were made throughout the landscape. In known sacred spaces, offerings were left throughout the course of time, suggesting continuous use for spiritual reasons, and in some cases possibly for seasonal or battle-related reasons. For example, Greek author Arrian in the 2nd century wrote that the Celts never went hunting without a blessing from the gods, which meant leaving an offering. Much of the votive offerings were things like jewelry, weapons, food, and liquid libations. It's possible that carved wooden figurines or trinkets were also left as offerings, but of course they would have decayed by now. Not all of the offerings were quite so innocent, though. There are accounts and archaeological evidence that shows us, as much as many in the neo-pagan community can often be hesitant to admit, that animal sacrifice was a thing, usually livestock or some other domestic animal. From what archaeologists and historians have been able to discern, these animal sacrifices were meant for transferring life force, or energy, to the other world, to please the gods and/or open up a line of communication with the deity. It was done for thanksgiving, appeasement, to ask for health, fertility, and divination. There appears to be 2 main ways that these sacrifices would be offered. 1, by burning or burying during a ritual, or 2, by being prepared in a feast, where part would be eaten and part would be set aside as the offering for the gods and goddesses. Here's another little content warning. The following segment has to do with people being unalived in less than humane ways by the standards of our modern day. If you're squeamish or sensitive to that kind of information, please feel free to skip over the upcoming section. Just be aware that there is a decent amount of historical info intertwined, so there may be some things that you end up missing. I'm also not entirely sure how far ahead you may need to skip in order to get to the next segment. My apologies in advance. I'll give you a moment. For those who are listening through, there is patchy evidence of some form of human sacrifice as well. There are accounts from both Greek and Roman sources, which we need to take with probably a couple handfuls of salt, what with the political agendas at the time. Julius Caesar and Strabo both claimed that the Gauls sacrificed criminals by putting them and sacrificial animals into a giant wickerwork figure, referred to as the Wicker Man. Caesar also wrote that when a Gaulish chief died, his slaves would be ritually killed and burned alongside their master as part of his funeral. Posidonius, another Greek historian and politician whose lifetime overlapped Caesar's, wrote that the Druids oversaw human sacrifices and foretold the future by observing the individual's death throes. There are some interesting archaeological findings in several ancient bogs in Ireland, though. Some of these Irish bog bodies are thought to mostly be kings or chiefs that were ritually killed after a very serious event. Droughts resulting in loss of crops, the loss of a major war between tribes, some kind of catastrophic natural event, things like that. Some of them were found to have eaten what appears to be a ceremonial last meal. A couple of other bog bodies were found with Roman artifacts. suggesting not so much a sacrifice by the Celts, but more likely thought to be Romans who were unfortunate enough to somehow find themselves committed to the bogs. Romans and Greeks were also quite insistent in their accounts that the Celts had a reputation for headhunting and ritual beheadings. There's a decent amount of archaeological evidence that supports these claims. The actions behind the headhunting lie in the ancient Celtic belief that the head is the seat of consciousness, the soul, the wisdom, and divinity as well. There were many reasons for ritual beheadings. Keeping the head of an enemy would mean that you captured control over your enemy's power. Archaeological evidence shows that heads were sometimes embalmed and displayed by the southern Gauls, which backs up Strabo's claims. Displaying the heads of defeated enemies was a way to earn prestige and respect among fellow warriors and demonstrated that warrior's courage. Some traditions involved using the skull of a revered ancestor to drink well water, as the head was associated with fertility and healing. Though I do find it interesting that the Romans in particular seemed to think that ritual beheading was a big no-no. It seems a little hypocritical. Let me tell you why. The River Walbrook, 1988 or 89. The many sources I've read give 2 different years. Archaeologists found 39 skulls in a pit trench-like area. Almost all were male, ranging from the ages of 18 to 35, though some sources say that the age range is more like 26 to 35. They date back to sometime between 120 and 160 CE. The skulls all present multiple fractures and other head traumas, some with evidence of healing, suggesting that these men lived violent lives. The London Museum seems to lean toward these men being gladiators, executed criminals, or war trophies, as removing the heads of your enemies was a show of bravery. It's quite clear that the Celts were not the only ones who had a thing for removing heads. But in the grand scheme of the world of the ancient Celts, ritual beheadings and headhuntings were actually quite rare, according to the archaeological findings to date. Let's go back to Caesar's account of what happened when chiefs died in Gaul, and expand on that a bit. Because there was generally a whole thing surrounding ancient Celtic burial practices. Cremation was a popular practice from the 8th to 5th centuries BCE. We're talking early Celts here. Over time, impressive burial mounds became more common for the more high-ranking and high-status individuals, with goods being buried alongside them. These grave goods included things like food, weapons, ornaments, jewelry, and their personal belongings. Lower status individuals got a much simpler burial, but these burial mounds suggest that there was a belief in some form of life after death. The mythologies from later, after the Christianization of the Celtic nations, mention the otherworld, a realm where the fairy folk and other supernatural beings and spirits reside. There are some claims that the otherworld was underground, while other claims say that it's a place far to the west. The mythologies kind of support a little of both, it seems. The otherworld may have been the ancient Celtic afterlife, but it seems that there were some beliefs surrounding a form of reincarnation as well, where the spirits reside in the otherworld temporarily before eventually reincarnating. There's no direct evidence to fully support either theory. I want to talk about the Christianization of the Celtic nations for a second, though, mainly to give you an idea of when and how certain beliefs and practices began to shift. We'll absolutely take a closer look at another time, but in talking about the otherworld and deities, Gaul gradually converted to Christianity from the 3rd century on. Ireland and Britain began their slow conversion from the 5th century on. What was left of Celtic paganism began being replaced by Anglo-Saxon paganism around 410 CE, after the end of Roman rule in Britain. Literary evidence surrounding religion comes mostly from sources in Ireland and Wales from the Middle Ages. By that point, traditional Celtic practices had long been replaced by Christianity. You can see a little bit of the mythology, though, that survives in those medieval writings. They take the form of epics and tales, written by monks. Unfortunately, they were written centuries after Christianity dominated the religion, so the combination of being hostile toward barbaric peoples combined with being ignorant of the actual ancient beliefs and practices, bringing us characters written as historical heroes rather than venerated gods and goddesses. Though there are a few things that seem apparent despite the writings of the monks. The elements were revered, and natural forces like thunder were seen as quite potent, and the behaviors of certain animals were seen as omens, as certain deities were closely associated with those certain animals. One example of the epics and tales is the Tuatha De Danann, which is about an Irish supernatural race of humans, rather than deities. We get very little from surviving ancient Celtic art as well. Most of it is not figurative, meaning that they are not generally of humans or animals, and though they likely have religious and spiritual significance, we will probably never truly know or understand what that is. Much of the surviving figurative art comes with Romano-Celtic context in the provincial Roman styles. Any stone sculptures dating from before the Romans are quite rare and vague, as wooden sculptures were likely much more common. So no one can exactly say that they practice ancient Celtic paganism, because we don't actually know what those practices were. However, there are people who have spent years studying all of the source material in order to be able to practice as closely as possible in our modern day. These folks are the Celtic Reconstructionists. A number of other practices and beliefs are based on or have taken inspiration from ancient Celtic traditions, such as eclectic paganism, neo-pagan witchcraft, neo-druidism, neo-shamanism, and Celtic Wicca. Like I said at the beginning, this is only the first episode that touches on the topic of Celtic paganism, so you can bet that in the future, I will have even more for you. In the meantime, if you're nerdy like me, I have some reading material and YouTubers that I recommend. The first is Celtic Paganism for Beginners, which is a YouTube episode by Jacob Todson of The Wisdom of Odin. The second is Early Irish Myths and Sagas by Penguin Classic Books. And then we have the Irish Pagan School, which is a YouTube channel with some pretty accurate information from what I've been able to see. And then there is the Candlelit Tales, which is another YouTube channel where you can learn a lot of the folklore. And finally, a book called The Celts, written by Alice Roberts. Thanks so much for tuning in and hanging out with me today. If you enjoyed this episode and don't want to miss out on future episodes, hit those like and follow buttons. What's your take on the movie The Craft? It's one of those classy spooky season movies, and next time we hang out, that's exactly what we'll talk about. I can't wait to share it with you. For now, you can find me on Facebook, Witchful Journey Podcast, on Instagram at _witchful_journey, on BlueSky at awitchfuljourney.bsky.social, and on YouTube, A Witchful Journey. I enjoy hearing from listeners, so if you pop in, say hi, leave me a rating, or if you're really feeling it, a review. If you'd like to contribute, donate, buy me my next podcast coffee, whatever you want to call it, check out A Witchful Journey on ko-fi.com. That's ko-fi.com. You can also send stories and experiences to awitchfuljourney@gmail.com. I'm April, and we are on a witchful journey.